I was successful in getting my old friend, former attorney. I met Chris in, I'll say what state. I think it was 1988, if I'm not mistaken. And he taught my real estate law class. That's how I met him. That was back when Jesus was a boy. So it's been a while. And Chris was my personal attorney for almost 40 years, did all my personal attorney stuff with me. And somewhere in the middle of his career, he went to work for one of the largest, if not the largest, land developers in Pierce County. So Chris has a lot of experience in land development and being a lawyer on both sides. And I wanted to bring him in today just to really to serve two purposes. One of the things he's going to do during his talk is give us a very, 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 very basic outline of how the land development process works. Okay. And I say very basic because, as a lot of us know, and as I know, there's a whole lot of difference between, oh, I'm going to build an ADU or subdivide my backyard versus I'm taking down 100 acres and doing a planned development district. They're both land development, but they're way different. And Chris has done all that stuff and in the middle. So his basic talk is going to be pared down, okay? And we're going to try to keep it at somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, something like that. There's a short outline that he and I talked about. As always, bring pencil and paper, make your notes. And then we'll have some time for Q&A, all right? And I have one sort of hard caveat about this. He is not here to give legal advice. You can ask whatever questions you want, but that's not his function today. He no longer practices. He is officially retired, but he has a wealth of information, and that's why he's here. And Chris, thanks for showing up. You're up.
Okay. Thanks for asking me, Joe. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I have to start. Of course, all of you that take this class already know this. Joe is the consummate salesman. So when he asked me to do this, he said, I want you to, teach this class on real estate development. Then he narrowed it down to land development. And of course, he realizes that there are whole semester long classes in law school and business school on land development. And he told me, you got 20 minutes to teach this class. And oh, by the way, keep it simple. And the consummate salesman part comes in. I said yes. So I've been saying yes to Joe for 40 years, though, so I was used to doing that. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and the checks never bounced. I'll just throw that in, but go ahead.
What's that?
The checks never bounced, but go ahead.
Okay, that's true. That's true. So this is a simple outline. Now we all realize, and you're all in the real estate biz, so you understand that there are every piece of land is unique. Like Joe said, if you're putting an ADU in your backyard, these rules apply, just as if you're developing 200 acres into a master planned community. The basic rules are the same. The differences are in the risk, the capital, and the complexity, the details. The devil's always in the details. So, but this is intended to be a simple guideline, which would apply to every land development. It assumes that the target property is already selected. So that is a big piece of the development, is buying the right piece of land or targeting the right piece of land to buy. It also assumes that market conditions, location, demographics, all those things have already been addressed, and you're already convinced that you want to buy this piece of land. So land development, as you can imagine, is not for the faint of heart. There are so many unknowns, so many things that you don't control, such as the market, such as the permit process, the financing market, etc., that it can change on, in a moment's notice. The old joke where I used to work as a as the head of the land development department, was that it's usually the third developer that actually completes the development. The first two have fabulous dreams about what they're going to do, but they either don't have enough capital, they did not adequately predict the amount of time it would take or the complexity of getting the approvals that they needed. And so they would fight hard, but they would end up either going bankrupt or having to sell because they ran out of money. And in at least two of the master planned communities that I worked on, my client was actually the third developer in, and he is the one that completed it. So that sort of highlights that land development is not for the faint of heart. Okay, let's talk about the steps. And these steps are not necessarily chronological because every piece of land is a little bit different. When you're looking for a piece of land, you're targeting a piece of land, one of the things you would likely do is a preliminary pro forma. In other words, as this course is entitled, does it pencil? That's what a pro forma is all about. And the sooner you can do that and essentially do your own feasibility, not land use or approval feasibility, but financial feasibility, the sooner you can do that, the better. Let's say you've done that, and we'll talk more about the pro forma a little bit later. But the first thing you do is you assemble the team, okay? If you are a broker representing either a buyer or a seller, the first step is going to be to retain an experienced land use attorney. And just as real estate has its specialties, commercial, industrial, residential, et cetera, all law practice also has its specialties. So hiring somebody that's experienced in land use law, that has worked in the jurisdiction that the property is in. In other words, you wouldn't want to hire a lawyer from Puyallup developing a plat in Gig Harbor unless they had also worked in Gig Harbor. So research the attorney you're going to hire. Find out how much experience they have. What is their success rate? Do they get projects approved, or do they just represent developers that eventually fail? And there are some of those. So the land use attorney is one of the keys. Secondly, hire a civil engineer with experience in land development. Again, the same thing applies as far as specialties go. And check out the qualifications of the engineer, their experience, their track record, and get to know them before you hire them. The civil engineer then will assist you in assembling the rest of the team, depending on the project. If it's a very complex project, you're probably going to have to hire a traffic engineer, a landscape architect, a tribal archaeological consultant, water engineers, design, all of those things, depending again on the project. But the civil engineer can recommend and help you fill out the team, if you will. So once the team is in place, if you haven't already done your pro forma, it's time to really see if it pencils. And what you're doing with a pro forma, you're trying to separate your soft costs and your hard costs. Another way to look at it, your knowns and your unknowns. You want to maximize the knowns and minimize the unknowns. Sounds easy, it's hard to do. But that is probably the most important thing you're going to do other than selecting the piece of land in the land development process. If your pro forma is lying to you because you want it to look good for a bank and you actually fall in love with it and believe it, you're probably going to fail. Okay, so be real with your pro forma. Don't kid yourself as it relates either to the market and the ultimate sales price of the lots you're developing, the time it's going to take you to get there. And time is the big thing. With two of the master plan communities I worked on, it was literally 12 years from the time the land was identified till the time the last lot was sold. Well, you can imagine how many market swings there were in that 12-year period. There were times that we didn't think we'd make it. There were times things were better than we thought they were going to be, and there are certainly times when they were worse. So you have to have staying power if you can get into the big number land development business. I meant to say this earlier. If you have any questions while I'm talking, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll deal with them as they come up. So, okay. Be realistic. Basically, be realistic with your time frames. Don't assume that the project's going to sell in 5 years when the market will not absorb that. So, and the temptation is always to make it try to look a little bit better for the bank than it really is, but also the danger there is that you start believing what you're writing down. So, don't do that. So let's talk about the paperwork a little bit. The documents that you're going to need in any transaction, of course, starts with the purchase and sale agreement. And if you're doing a relatively simple transaction, it's probably okay to use a pre-printed form. But the more complex it gets, the less likely that form is going to be the best thing to use. That's where the experienced land use attorney comes in. He will draft the agreement, and of course, for his client. So if the client is a buyer, he's going to draft it one way. If he's a seller, he's going to draft it a different way. You usually want to have your attorney be the one to do the first draft, because you can set the tone for the whole transaction in that document. Doesn't mean you're going to get everything that's in that first draft by the time you get signed, but you're just better off setting the tone from your perspective and what you're trying to accomplish. If you do use a pre-printed agreement, okay, the meat of the agreement is not going to be in those spaces that you fill in. The meat of the agreement is going to be in the addendum that essentially customizes that pre-printed form to fit your transaction. And be careful if no matter who you're representing, in trying to prepare that addendum yourself. Joe will remember back when he took my real estate law course, there was a Washington Supreme Court case that had been recently decided. It was called Cultum versus Heritage House.
Oh my gosh.
Realtors, right? And that is a case about the unauthorized practice of law. And at the end of the day, the brokers who prepared that agreement ended up liable for the consequences of doing so. I won't go into a lot of the detail, but the bottom line is it set the law of the unauthorized practice of law by realtors. And it says you can fill in the blanks on pre-printed forms, but when you get into drafting the addendum, it's much more you're drafting the contract, you're practicing law. So, and that law has never changed. I mean, it's still considered the unauthorized practice of law. So be wary of that. Also,
Can I pause you there just for a second, Chris?
please do.
Okay. Just because I know you guys better than he does. And that there's instead of waiting till the end, I want to kind of stop at the middle and give him the second to take a breath. There's a couple of points that he's made that I just want to really emphasize. Okay. Starting at the purchase and sale agreement, then working back to the beginning. All of you, no matter what state you're in, are accustomed to your forms. Okay. Which, why wouldn't you be? It's what you do every day. As a fellow broker and as someone who has sat in court in front of a judge not a lot, but a couple times. I cannot emphasize enough the last thing that Chris just said, especially practicing in the state of Washington. I watched Jeff go, "Oh my God, the broker is liable." The broker is 100% liable for their own drafting. Okay. It is called the unauthorized practice of law, depending on the complexity, but it is the addendum that gets people in trouble on land deals. And I've seen the preprinted forms for land in the MLS. They're not comprehensive enough, even for what I would call a simple transaction. Okay. And I've also been in negotiations as a broker where I brought in on the buying side a contract prepared by an attorney. And I had one broker say, "Well, that's illegal." I'm like, probably not. Okay. So I just want to emphasize and also lend a note of caution. Use your forms because that's what we're used to, but just be super careful about this addendum thing. Okay. That's the thing that'll get you in trouble. Okay. Put a sticky note on that. It's a big deal. Okay. Chris also talked about getting an attorney in the jurisdiction that you're working in. I don't know if he's going to talk about this more later, but I'm just going to kind of set it up right now. When you get into permit application, when you get into mitigations, when you get into doing the deal, like you're in the deal, you're taking the land through the entitlement process, relationships matter a lot. And working with people that work with the public officials regularly, you want to think it's all fair, and it's a relationship business. Okay. So having people local who know the people that are going to be doing the plan checks, it's an enormous benefit. It is huge. Okay. Now, I don't know if Chris is going to touch back much on the development costs, but I just want to say this because I've been doing this a long time. I put development costs into two simple boxes. Okay. Hard costs and soft costs. I'll start with soft costs. This is paying the lawyer, paying the civil engineer, paying the architect. Okay. And the reason I think this is so important is because if you spend most of your time working in the practice of selling primary residences, which most of you do, you're going to run across the occasional client who's like, "Oh, I inherited the family farm and the parents are dead. We want to sell it, but we want all the money," So what happens is, and I've been in this conversation, the conversation starts shifting towards, well, they really want you as the realtor to be their developer. Okay. So word of caution on that, number one. Number two, if you're going to do land development, it takes cash to do it. And I'm not talking about the cash to buy the land. I'm talking about the development costs, and those are soft costs. And there has to be cash to pay these people. It's a front-end load, back-end pay business. That's just how the model is built. And don't kid yourself about that. Okay. And again, I'm not talking about the money to acquire the property. I'm talking about the money to develop the property. Okay. So that's soft costs. Hard costs are the costs of, running the sewer line, bringing the water in, running the utilities, all that kind of stuff that one does to get the land ready for build or resale. Okay. So it's that combination of those two costs that really build this pro forma. And that's the middle line. Okay. The top line is what you can sell it for if you're a reseller. Most of these people are. That's a known. Like you have a pretty good idea, subject market swings, what's going to happen there. This is what you guys do. Okay. You get that part. It's the middle part that is the rub. Okay. And that leads you to, the metaphorical bottom line. But if you've never done this before, having those relationships with the civil engineer, with the planner and director of public works, I've told you guys a million times, this is a specialty practice within the real estate industry, and that pro forma is a big deal. Okay. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll shut up for now after, is this, the balance of time and money. Okay. Land development, and I've not done a tremendous amount of it, not as much as Chris, but I've done it. And I can tell you from having been a broker and a principal, it takes longer than you think it's going to. Okay. It just does. Okay. Now, I've never been involved in a deal that took 12 years, but even us buying that dumb little house in Lakewood, short platting it and spinning off the lot, it took a year. It took 12 months, well, 11 and a half or something like that.
It's
Okay.
actually pretty
So-
fast, Joe.
Well, yeah, and maybe that was, in the so-called back in the day, that might have taken 2 years. But there's, things have changed and whatever and so forth. The last thing I'll say is this. The director of community development, the planner in the city or county of jurisdiction, that's your lead government person that you're working with. Okay, now if you have a pre-development conference, and Chris will talk about those, you're going to get water, firemen, health department, all power, all that kind of thing. But the planner is the lead. And what's happening right now post-COVID in Pierce County, where I've worked, but also in King County, as I've heard, not worked there, but I've heard, there's an enormous lack of planners to do plan review. They're subcontracting this out. And that in and of itself is adding a lot of time to the process. So you're sitting down negotiating this deal, and the buyer's going, well, I want to make sure I have a permit. And the seller's going, well, I want my money in 30 days. Okay. So that's going to be the rub in the negotiation. So you as the negotiator, the mediator of the parties, really need to have your information and make sure that you do your homework, make your calls, have your meetings to really get a grip on the amount of time it's going to take to do what you're trying to do. And then probably add like 20%. Okay, Chris, back to you.
Or 50%. Well, Joe just proved my point when I talked to him originally. He doesn't even need me to teach this class. He's been there, he's done it, and being the teacher that he is, he can do a much better job than I can. However, I'll
Well, you're
keep
here,
talking anyway.
so it's your turn.
Because I used to be a lawyer. So, let's talk about the development process. Joe made reference to the pre-development meeting. Absolutely critical to the success of the approval process. Meeting all the people that are going to take a look at the plans, site planners, the environmental people, all of the various sub-agencies in the county or the city that are going to get a shot at trying to impose conditions on your project. You can learn more at the pre-development conference than almost any other way. So make sure, whether you're the broker or the buyer or the seller, make sure you attend it with your legal or civil engineering representatives. Don't let them go alone, because they may give some things away you don't want them to give away. And they may forget to tell you about things that turn out to be really important. So it's important that you participate in that process. Trying to think what Joe didn't talk about, and it's really not much. One thing I would reemphasize that it's always going to take longer than you think. And the best way to gauge that is to talk to people that have developed in that jurisdiction, whether it's Pierce County, King County, one of the cities, whatever it is. Find out how long are their processes taking. How long is it going to be from the time you make your complete application to the time you're going to get a hearing? Like Joe said, right now they're having trouble having enough people to do plan review. So they farm it out to civil engineering firms on contract to review the plans. And that's an uncontrolled process, right? So always figure it's going to take at least 20% more time than your initial thought. So, and I don't have to say this because you all know it, but time is money. The more delay you have in getting a project approved, the more delay you're going to have in getting it built. So the process just elongates, and every day that passes costs you more money, particularly if you're financing the project. People that have their own capital in it, those are the ones eventually that succeed because they don't get eaten up by the interest expense. So
Hey, Chris.
I think I'd like to just open it up for questions now. And feel free to ask Jay as well as me any questions you might have.
Before we move forward, Aaron, let me just fill in, then you're next, okay? I've been through pre-development more recently than Chris has, so I want to just kind of add a little bit to that, okay? So first of all, what he said, 100%, make sure you go to that meeting. You must attend that meeting, okay? And they're usually on Zoom, at least these days they are. And there's going to be 6 to 8 different people from the public sector who are there, okay? City engineer, or this is city or county, okay? So you have a planner, engineer, water, sewer, fire, power, and maybe the health department, depending if your thing requires a health department plan check. That is a critical meeting that sometimes gives you a go, no go signal on your plan, okay? Now, our little house in Lakewood, I'll reference again. I was teaching Desert Pencil this week. I had more time and another camera to draw a little picture, but we were originally going to go in and create 2 additional lots. If we were going to do that, we found this out at the pre-development conference, the city engineer said, well, if you're going to do 2 additional lots, we, the city, are going to take as a right-of-way 10 feet of your frontage for future curb gutter, sidewalk, and street lighting. Okay. And I said, anything else you want? Yeah, $80,000. Oh, okay. Well, this house was it was on a frontage road, major arterial, 5-lane arterial, and it was a middle house. It wasn't like on the corner. So I said, okay, well, riddle me this, Mr. City Engineer. When are you going to do these improvements? Answer, we don't know. Oh, so you're just land banking 10 feet of our land that we just bought and paid money for. And what are you going to do with everybody on either side of us when you actually do these future improvements? That will be an eminent domain taking, will it not? Well, yeah. Oh, last I heard from real estate law in 1988 from Chris Huss was eminent domain requires fair compensation in exchange for the taking, does it not? Silence. Now, my partner in that deal is a broker too. We both kind of knew this, but that meeting, because of it was an unknown. We didn't know they were going to do it so much of the meeting. It was an unknown. We said, oh, well, if we just do 1 lot, we don't have to give you 10 feet, pay the money, ... So that took us from our original concept of 2 lots down to 1. Okay. That was because of the pre-development conference. We wouldn't have known otherwise.
And that's a meeting you pay for.
It is. Yeah. And in the jurisdiction that I was in, it was like $300. And there's is there a public notice for a pre-development, Chris? No, I don't think there was for that.
I haven't filed for a permit yet.
Yeah, I don't think there was, but it took about
Yeah.
2.5 months from the time of filling out the application and paying the money to get the meeting. Okay. And that's like this much of due diligence. So this time thing, it's a thing. Okay. That's the end of my sermon. Hang on a sec. Aaron, you were next.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, when you're building your pro forma, like if there's a certain return that you're like, all right, this project is not investable because it's not hitting a certain return. Is there like a magic number in this kind of deal?
What would Mike
Not
say
really.
about that, Chris?
What's that?
What would Mike say about that?
Yeah, right. Every developer is different. This may be the only project that they're ever going to do, and they're trying to hit a home run. So they're looking for a greater return. It may be a company that does dozens of these projects, and they may have an internal rate of return that they look to achieve. So it depends on who is doing the development. But that's a good point. When you're building the pro forma, though, you should build it in a way where you target various rates of return to figure out what it's going to take, what your market price is going to have to be, and see if you can achieve that. So test all possibilities is what I'm saying. So
And I'm assuming too that that helps you build like what your offer is going to be to buy.
Yeah, for
Right.
sure.
absolutely.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
sure. It's a real catch-22. You know, like you don't know until you can lock up the property and do your due diligence. This was always a problem when I was negotiating these contracts as a broker. But I would answer the question this way, Aaron. I think that the final answer correlates to the amount of risk. You know, if you've got an established city lot, you're doing a short plat, and you know enough that yeah, it'll probably work. This will happen. Versus, oh well, I'm buying 50 acres on I-90 east of Ellensburg. It's a different deal, right?
Yeah.
But I would numerize your question this way. If I was investing, I want to make at least 30 to 50%
30
return
to
on
50?
capital.
Okay.
Yeah, because look, man, right now I can go out in the stock market, at least before this week, and earn about at least, the S&P is up 16% year to date. Gold's up over 30. This is the alternative investment thing I talk about in Desert Pencil. Okay, Sue, you had a question?
Me?
Go ahead.
So yeah, I was just wondering, do you have experience with annexations and development agreements?
And they're very, very time consuming and lengthy processes. Um, if the success of your project depends on getting annexation approved, you better have a lot of working capital. That's about all I would say about that.
So as a property owner or in that process, and we chose to do it without a developer, which we're questioning at this point.
What jurisdiction are you in? What city or county?
We're in Snohomish County.
Have you talked to the planner and asked them about how long it's going to take?
Yeah, it's all guesstimates, but things are working very slowly.
Yeah. And the biggest risk, of course, at the end of the day, it doesn't get approved. So, do you already own the land or?
We do. Yeah.
Okay. That's a little bit better than buying land on the hopes that you can get it annexed to another jurisdiction or that kind of thing. So
The other thing, I just want to circle back real quick to what I was saying in my example about the dedication of right of way and the payment of money. That's called mitigations. Okay. And when you talk about annexation and development of larger parcels, you also have to look at mitigations. Okay. Now, from the private sector, I would say these are oftentimes hostage negotiations. And these cities and counties are like, what can we get out of you? And they might say, oh, we want swing sets or, road improvements or whatever it is. But they want something. And during the public notice process, if you have to go to public hearings like I used to do, these neighborhood groups show up and they just like, oh, you're just that son of a bitch developer. You're going to give us whatever we want. And a part of the argument is because you don't live here. So the whole neighborhood group thing, that's a whole nother thing that might come up in your situation. And I'm not saying they're wrong or right. It just is what it is.
in
Joe,
a
would
lot
you
of
like me to
jurisdiction-
weigh in a little on annexation?
I would love you to weigh in, Ginger. You have the floor.
Okay, so I've actually only been through I've been through at least one. Maybe I've been through two annexations. I don't remember now for sure. But here's the thing. I don't know how long your timeline has been, but I would say anticipate that it could be a couple years before you get annexed. And the reason that your city official can't quite give you an answer, or I guess I'll even take back the can't quite. They really can't give you an answer because it's a very long and there are a lot of unknowns. And yeah, be prepared. My partner at the time, he'd come home from those meetings and the neighborhood protests and things, they're a ride, that's a real thing. So be prepared for that. and be prepared for it to take a while. Now, if you were to go ask a developer, for instance, to buy in on your project right now, they're going to give you a lower price, I would think, because they're going to hire professionals to help you get this job done, and or have professionals on the team that they're paying. And on top of that, they're going to ask you for a longer timeline to close. They'll put it on a feasibility most likely, and that feasibility will probably include something like closing at preliminary plat approval is pretty common, and that's when they would then start construction. That's when they have their knowns.
Yeah. And I just met Ginger this week in Desert Pencil, and I'll just kind of say she has a pretty extensive history of land development. Chris, let me ask you a question going back to what Ginger said. Drafting the purchase and sale agreement subject to the receipt of certain documents. Can you just tell us generically, in terms of the law, how does one draft with date certain in the background and not violating the statute of frauds?
Well, as long as it's a measurable date, such as preliminary plat approval, you can build your conditions on things to occur. So, and of course, as a buyer, you want to make, I mean, ideally, you would not be obligated to close until the last possible review of the last possible approval is granted. Most sellers aren't going to go with that. So, if you can get preliminary plat approval, or in the larger projects, master plan approval, as the condition for closing, you're doing about as well as you can be able to do. And then you take the risk of that getting reversed on appeal later.
So Chris, what ends up happening most of the times then, if you're approaching somebody that's got, quite a bit of land and you're building a master plan development and it's going to take you a long time, or maybe even it's a smaller project, but big enough that it's going to take some time, like, does the developer have to then just fork over some non-refundable earnest money in order to, at least be willing to lose that, so that they have enough time to get to their knowns without having to really lose the.
It's all part of the negotiation. As the earnest money, the non-refundable earnest money is a quite common way to compensate a impatient seller. In other words, you have to buy your extensions, essentially. And then as the buyer, you just add that to the cost, the pre-closing costs, the soft costs that Joe's talking about, of all the money you have to spend to get to the approval process. And a lot of those are front loaded. So, but that's quite a common way to do it, the non-refundable earnest money.
Yeah, so this gets back to the drafting. And when I was doing more of this on a full-time basis, I had a partner I was working with. We were taking down land. We were building gas stations and with restaurants built into them. The way that I draft the purchase agreements is we would front load the purchase agreement with the buyer's ability to purchase extensions after the expiration of the initial feasibility. And then, like Chris said, it just becomes a negotiation. If you're the buyer, you don't want to pay anything. And if you're seller, you want to start seeing some cash. You want to make that earnest money earnest, and that's just how the game is played. It just is what it is, Now, one of the things that has come up here in terms like annexation, master development, 12 years, that kind of thing. And I just want to kind of circle back to my opening comments. The basic steps that Chris has outlined are the same no matter what you're doing, but there's just different rabbit holes that can make stuff last a lot longer. Okay. Now, one of the things, going back to what Sue said, and this happened to me one time on a deal that we were doing, is we got a lot of pushback from the neighborhood community. Okay. Now, you've all seen these signs, notice of intended land use action, right? That's the public notice. Well, I've worked mostly in Pierce. I worked some in King County, but mostly in Pierce. And I would assume that most counties have a somewhat similar protocol, but this is a legislative process. So, if you have a 60-day window for the public to make notices, and I'll just pick a date here. Let's say that your last day is April 30th, okay? Do not be surprised. Oh, April 30th at 3 p.m. Do not be surprised if the attorney for the I'll just pick the neighborhood group as one opposition group. If they don't file their objection letter at 2:45 on the last day, they are famous and notorious for that. And then all of a sudden, the whole thing stops. Because then it has to go to the next level of appeal, which is probably the city or county council. And then that's the same thing. And if that doesn't satisfy the aggrieved party, then it goes to the hearings examiner. Okay? And if that doesn't satisfy the aggrieved party, then it goes to district court. And if I'm not
Sure.
mistaken, it's at the court level that prevailing party gets attorney's fees. It might be hearing examiner, I don't know. But if you take that line of time and just stretch it out, it's at least a year.
Well, more
least.
than that, Joe. More
Well,
than that.
at
yeah.
least.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we say, well, how long is it going to take? It kind of depends on how many people are bitching. That's kind of it. You know, once you comply
And-
with the land use code, you're compliant.
Yeah, and that brings up another point that I should have made earlier, and that is if you're doing a development wherever it might be, and you anticipate there's going to be neighborhood pushback, get out ahead of that.
Yeah.
Go meet with the people that are most severely affected.
Yep.
Find yourself out, people that are willing to be advocates for what you're doing, because you're going to be able to tell them these are all the wonderful things we can do for your neighborhood, right? So if you can get out ahead of that, you're not going to completely eliminate the pushback, but you've got a much better chance of the political people that eventually are going to hear this, making the right decision. So
That's an excellent point. Excellent. And isn't that weird? Political people in Seattle? Huh. Who would have thought?
or anywhere else for that matter.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, because it's a point in the process where the process does not become a land use approval as much as it does a political approval. That's why it's good to have a relationship with your county council and your city council and the people that ultimately might be looking at an appeal from a land use decision, because those decisions aren't always made on a land use basis.
Yeah.
So
So you're next, but let me just add something to this because things are happening here. Once you do this enough times, you begin to see a pattern, and this is the pattern. When you go to a council meeting where there's a vote to approve or deny your proposal, I'm going to say in my experience, which may not be complete, but it's my experience, 9 times out of 10, those people take the recommendation of staff. Okay. So if you have a good relationship with staff and those are the people that you meet at the counter and your project is compliant, that is one of the best ways to get the thing through the first hurdle. Okay. I mean, I've just seen this so many times, rezones, development, stuff like that. They'll ask their questions, those in the power to decide, but they always go with recommendations of staff. That's just what
the
I've seen.
planning department's recommendations, like Joe said, at least 90% of the time carry the day.
Yeah.
It's a very unusual situation that that would not be the case.
Yeah, because most people sitting on city and county council, they don't have a formal resume of land use development. This is just one of the things that they have to vote on as a part of, being in a democracy. Okay. All right, Sue, you got a follow up?
Yeah, that was a great question that previous gentleman asked. I was wondering, how much are you seeing typically for upfront earnest money at this point as a percentage of the purchase price?
I haven't been in it for so long. I really don't feel I should try to answer that question. Joe, do you have any recent experience on
Well,
that?
the general answer is the seller wants as much as the bar wants to pay the lease.
It's
When
deal
I started
specific.
doing this, and my land career started in the early 90s, I controlled millions of dollars of property, and I never put up one greenback dollar of earnest money, it was all done on promissory notes. Okay, which is, you go into a residential person, they go, oh, that's illegal. No, it's not. Then the note is converted to cash once feasibility is completed. That's how I learned how to do it. But I would say as a rule of thumb, and it kind of depends on the total number you're talking about here, if you look at a percent, but I'd say, between 1 and 5, something like that. Anybody else got anything to say about that?
I was just thinking, so with, back in like the insanity of like 21, people were, addendums were created that would say that your earnest money would convert to a non-refundable deposit because the state's safe harbor rule, you can only keep 5% of the purchase price. So anything over that, could, I guess, be returned by a judge, if it got to that point. So is it how does that work with all that? Well, that's an attorney question, but
Well, my understanding is parties have freedom to contract, so you could put up 10% if you wanted to. Am I wrong about that?
no. When we were like, I would receive like an insane, like 250, $500,000, like non-refundable earnest money that would convert to a deposit after X amount of time to skirt around that 5% safe harbor rule.
Yeah,
people-
so I'm not a lawyer. I'm a real estate broker, a licensed managing broker. And I think what the state law says that earnest money can only be up to 5% of the purchase price, or yes, they could recover it in court, the difference, But by using the language, earnest money shall convert to non-refundable deposit at X date or after feasibility or something. By that, then you get around that aspect of the real estate law. But let's just say they put down in my opinion, I think you would have to also be careful. Let's say you want to get a larger than 5% non-refundable deposit. Maybe you have the buyer within the contract put down up to 5% as earnest money, and then non-refundable deposit shall be paid to seller at completion of feasibility, for instance, of X dollars.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that those purchase extensions would be non-refundable deposits. And
Yes.
then it'd be separate from your 5% earnest money.
Non-refundable to the buyer and applicable to the purchase price.
And
Yeah.
you could also use the language as a cash. I was going to say cash payment. I might be wrong about that part, but convert to cash to seller at X date. So the seller could actually access that cash and have it
Yeah.
as you move through the process,
Yeah, it's dispersible to the seller.
Yep.
That's an escrow instruction.
I would
Another
wonder
reason
if
to use
that-
a competent licensed attorney when drafting said agreements.
I would wonder if that methodology has ever been tested in court. Because really, all you're doing is changing the title of the same thing from earnest money to non-refundable deposit and trying to get around the 5% rule. That's what I would argue if I was on the other side of it. But
Right.
Yeah, and I
That's-
think that's why they added that language in there, because back during that period of time, like people were just increasing their earnest money amounts just obscene, just because it looks good off paper, but there was no precedent set.
Yeah.
No lawsuit to try to recover that $250,000 over your 5% rule.
Well, I can say that in say 2020, 2021, 2020, yeah, probably that time period. I know that I looked at houses and had buyers offer on houses where they ended up with a non-refundable earnest money of 200,000 plus, like 250, for instance. Converting to cash, right? Earnest money, then converting to cash early in the process when buyers were waiving all conditions and stuff on, say, $1.5 million purchase price. And that's definitely more than 5%, right? So, and enough of those happened that I would think it's been tested in court, but I don't know.
Yeah.
It's hard
Well,
to say. Because I've been practicing for 3 years, not following the cases, but I would be surprised if it hadn't been tested.
Yeah.
Because it's a pretty transparent way to just dodge the statutory intent. So anyway, probably
No,
enough.
I'm glad that we brought up the 2021, 2020 time, okay? Because, you know, obviously now we're in a different market, but we're here today to talk about land and specifically land development. And so as a broker and as a developer, I cannot emphasize enough on the buying side. Do not buy land without contingencies. That's a fool's errand. Okay, it's dumb. Unless you're just getting like the fire sale of the century and you know enough about it already. But there are so many things that can come up that, you know, Chris just gave little lip service to. We haven't even talked about, like, you know, geotech studies and, you know, how far are you from a fire hydrant? And that might require having a contained fire suppression system in your
Well,
building.
like the example you used, Joe, the unknown former gas station underneath the property, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Gas
so-
tank.
Yeah.
How did you
so-
write that contingency? Who
Yeah.
bore the risk of that one?
Yeah, I'll tell you guys that story. We'll wrap this up. So this would have been in the 90s when I was doing more third-party brokerage, where I started doing my own stuff. And I represented a buyer, and they wanted to buy an office building. And I was in Tacoma at the time, and we found this little office building down in the Tide Flats of Tacoma. And because I had probably the world's best real estate law teacher, he said, you know, get a lawyer to write the damn contract. I said, okay. And so I went to a different firm who was the firm of my client. And this attorney who I'd never met, but we talked about it, we wrote it up. See, back then, especially in the Port of Tacoma, the big buzz was the toxic stuff. Okay, the Superfund Model Toxics Control Act. And I worked in commercial real estate, so this was a huge thing. Lots of seminars on it. It was a thing. Not in residential, but in commercial, it was a thing. So on everybody's radar. So this guy wrote this contract that essentially said that the buyer had the ability to go in and do what's called a phase 1 environmental audit. Maybe another webinar I'll talk about the environmental stuff a little bit. I've done quite a bit of it. And then if it was conclusive from the phase 1 environmental audit that a phase 2 is required, that the buyer had the ability to do that. Now, the reason that's important is because if a property is deemed toxic, if it has contaminants on it, and a licensed engineer discovers this, they are required to report this to the Department of Ecology. They can't just hide it, okay? And that's their license on the line if they don't, okay? So they have tons of risk and no returns. Like, well, we'll just kind of, you know, not worry about this one. No, that's not how it works, okay? So getting the contractual ability to do it was very important. Well, as it turns out, it was either phase 1 or phase 2, but if you don't know this, our state does flyovers every year, and they take pictures of pretty much everything. I mean, maybe not like in Othello, but in the Puget Sound they do. And I used to go buy these at the Washington Department of Transportation. And one of the things they're looking for is people building stuff without permits. Okay. There is a part of the government that does this and has been for at least 20 years that I know of. Anyway, it turns out this office building used to be a Phillips 66 station, like in the 50s or something like that. Okay. And so then we went into what's called phase 2, which is core sampling of the dirt. Okay. We paid for it, but come to find out, it had USTs, underground storage tanks, that had to be removed, and they'd bled. Okay. The price of the building was like $300,000. We bought it from a credit union, actually. And the way the contract was written was, if the property was deemed contaminated, the seller was compelled to pay for the cleanup so the buyer could buy it contaminant free. Okay. All this stuff was front loaded on the purchase and sale agreement. We didn't know. Nobody knew. So here we are mitigating risk in the land of unknowns. turns out they paid more to clean up that land than the price of the building we purchased. And no surprise, I did not get a Christmas card from the seller that year. Okay. Now that's just one of many stories. Okay. And that's a story that reinforces the importance in these more complex transactions of having someone draft who knows what the hell they're doing.
Hey, Joe.
I can't emphasize this enough. Yeah.
So are there like insurance policies that can protect you from like crazy shit like that comes up? Like, I know like with underground storage tanks for like oil tanks, they used to have PLEA. Now they have like some form of like policy that you can get, no, it's a grant from the state, I think. But are there like if you're kind of a bigger scale developer, like are there insurance for things like that can come up?
Insurance for what? You buy the land and you find out that it's contaminated?
Yeah, by something. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I would think if you could prove the insurance company it wasn't contaminated, they'd sell you an insurance policy that says the same thing. But without that, I don't think they're going to take on that risk.
Okay.
At least not for a premium that's anywhere reasonable.
Yeah, I can tell you this because I was involved in this pretty heavily in the mid and late 90s. There was a court case at the time because it was a situation where there was a cleanup bill and who was going to pay for it. Okay. And lots of money in legal fees to argue this case. Well, at the end, the judge kind of just did a proration based on the amount of time. Okay. It was actually a chain of title case is what it was. That's what it was. Because the property had been contaminated by the previous owner and not the current owner. It was convoluted.
Yeah.
But here's one thing that the court said that I thought was a good takeaway. The court established a standard, and it said that the reasonable standard of practice for buyers is to do a phase 1 environmental audit. That was the standard of care, at least in that case, that the court established. Okay. So we'll wrap up with this. If you are looking at doing a piece of land and it's something other than, an established residential plat, other than an ADU, DADU, that kind of thing, okay? Or if you're in an industrial area or another place you have reasonable suspicion that there might be some kind of contaminants. We looked at buying a building one time in Enumclaw and found out that the guy that owned it was cleaning motors and putting them into big vats of toxic solution. And when it got too full of carbon and oil, they just pushed out the back door and poured into the land. We found that out one time too. Okay. So, crazy shit happens. But I'm just kind of putting it on your radar. The phase 1 environmental audit is a prudent thing to do if obvious conditions warrant it. Okay. It's a little insurance policy that you buy just in case. And I've done a couple of leases since then with companies who are contaminators just by the nature of their business. And so as a part of a lease agreement, we did a phase 1 to establish a baseline. So at the end of that lease, whenever it would be the initial term or the options to extend, that the landlord could go back and have a yardstick to measure against to see if the tenant had in fact contaminated the property.
And if you're doing any financing on the transaction at all, any bank is going to require a phase 1 at a minimum. So,
yep. Okay. Anybody else got any questions, burning desires? All right. Let's give Chris a soft clap for showing up today. Thank you, sir.
my pleasure.
Okay, everybody. This was a good session. Thanks for showing up. And next week, same bat time, same bat channel. God bless you and have a good weekend.